Before I make my opening remarks, I would like to extend our appreciation to the co-hosts of this webinar. These are the permanent missions of Belarus, Bolivia, China, Cuba, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Nicaragua, Russia, Syria, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. We want to extend our thanks to the missions for having found it appropriate to co-host this very important webinar. These are my remarks, Your Excellencies, experts, panelists, and all those who have joined us either this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. Unilateral coercive measures continue to seriously undermine the socio-economic development of affected developing countries and gravely violate the right to life and a decent living for the peoples in these countries. In several resolutions and declarations adopted by United Nations entities and human rights bodies, including the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, increasing concerns and condemnation have been expressed regarding the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, including sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights, particularly the human rights of the population of the targeted states. However, and contrary to the norms of international law and the UN Charter, unilateral coercive measures continue to be promulgated, implemented, and enforced, despite their negative implications for social humanitarian activities, as well as the economic and social development of targeted developing countries, including their extraterritorial effects. Simultaneously, unilateral coercive measures severely impede the health capacity and access to health care, as well as the well-being of the population in affected countries, with particular consequences for women, children, adolescents, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. The intensified blockade and sanctions targeting the banking sector, along with the freezing of financial and banking assets abroad, gravely undermine the targeted states, their health capacity, and their ability to finance the purchase of basic needs for their citizens, including the provision of medicines, vaccines, life-saving medical supplies, and technologies related to the diagnosis and treatment of diseases in a timely manner, with women, children, persons with disabilities, and other people in vulnerable situations who suffer greatly. Under the current circumstances arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, the negative consequences of such measures on the public health of targeted countries have been exacerbated. Undoubtedly, the international community, in particular the United Nations, has a critical responsibility to take into consideration the detrimental impact of these measures and take the necessary concrete actions in order to ensure the safety and well-being of targeted countries, their populations, which amount currently to over 1/3 of humanity. In this regard, this webinar has been organized to provide a platform for the exchange of views among states, raise awareness, as well as elaborate and identify ways and means to ensure the implementation of the resolutions and declarations adopted by the United Nations entities and human rights bodies, including the General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council, on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the affected developing countries in order to enable their healthcare systems to respond effectively and efficiently to public health challenges. Your Excellencies, panelists, as well as other stakeholders, we are delighted to have very distinguished panelists who are going to discuss this subject, which I think is of great importance to the world today. We have three eminent panelists, and I will introduce them in that order, and hopefully we should be able to benefit from their wise counsel. First, we have Ms. Elena Dohan, who is the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. We shall also have Mr. Zamil Akram, the Chair Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council Working Group on the Right to Development. And thirdly, we shall have Dr. Janet Blake, the Professor of International and Human Rights Law, University of Shahid Behesht, Tehran. Each of our distinguished panelists will have 3 minutes. We'll have 7 minutes to make his or her remarks. So first, we have Ms. Elena Dohan. I am privileged here in Kampala to say this evening, I would say in New York, that this afternoon, to introduce Madame Elena Dohan. Ms. Elena Dohan was in March 2020, that's last year, appointed by the Human Rights Council as the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, pursuant to Resolution 27/21 and 36/10. Ms. Elena Dohan took office on 25th March 2020. Ms. Dohan has extensive experience in the fields of international law and human rights as a professor of international law at the Belarusian State University of Minsk. She's a visiting professor at the Institute for International Law, Peace and Armed Conflict at Bochum, Germany, and the director of the Peace Research Center. She received her PhD, I should have said Dr. Dohan, at the Belarusian State University in 2005 and obtained a doctorate in international law and European law in 2015 in Belarus. Ms. Dohan's academic and research interests are in the fields of international law, sanctions and human rights law, international security law, the law of international organizations, the international dispute settlement, sanctions and human rights law. International would never have had a better person than Ms. Dohan to take us through the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures. With this, I invite you, Dr. Elena Dohan, to make your remarks in 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to extend my appreciation to the organizers and co-hosts of webinar, which made it possible to discuss such an important aspects. And I also would like to thank the corresponding governments for the permanent support of the mandate. It's a privilege for me to be here and to present some of my findings at this virtual seminar, especially as concerned the negative impact of unilateral sanctions on the national health systems of targeted states, especially at the well-being of women, children, and people in vulnerable situations. Sanctioned states are traditionally highlight common goods objectives in the implementation of unilateral sanctions. They refer to the legitimate purposes, the targeted character, the absence of extraterritoriality over compliance, and absence of negative humanitarian impact. Unfortunately, this all is very far from reality. It has been repeatedly reported by states, humanitarian organizations, and individuals that the impact of unilateral sanctions over national health systems is enormous. Excellencies, some of my previous statements, as well as my report to the UN General Assembly in October 2020, has been devoted to the humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Numerous cases of frozen funds, the impossibility to do bank transfers, as well as other impediments to deliver humanitarian aid, medical supplies, and all sorts of essential goods have been repeatedly cited. However, I would like to stress that the impact of unilateral sanctions over the national health sector of targeted states is not limited to the period of COVID-19 pandemic only. First of all, deteriorating economic situation exacerbated by impediments to buying and delivery of equipment, spare parts and raw materials affect the ability of target states to maintain necessary critical infrastructure. Shortages of electricity, gas, and water facilities results the spread of various forms of diseases. The lack of gasoline impedes the ability of people to get access to medical aid. Hyperinflation and rising poverty prevent people from using paid medical services. Economic crisis resulting from or exacerbated by the application of unilateral sanctions undermine the ability of targeted governments to develop and even maintain necessary medical infrastructure directly. They often face problems in buying medical equipment, spare parts for existing equipments, software, raw materials for production of medicine, reagents for tests, medicines, protective kits, and vaccines. The shortage of necessary equipment and medicine results in rising prices, corruption, and functioning of black markets. Low salaries in the public sector result in the flow of doctors and nurses, making access to medical aid even more complicated. This all results in unavailability of medical aid for those who are in need, especially as concerns people with oncology, those who need surgeries, people with diabetes, hepatitis, HIV, and many other serious or chronic diseases. Targeted countries report episodes of measles, polio, yellow fever, and malaria because of the shortage of vaccines. Because of the same reasons, countries have to stop social support programs, including coverage of expensive operations abroad and family planning programs. This results in rising rates of mortality because of severe diseases, mother and infant mortality rates, teenage pregnancies, increasing number of cases of opportunistic infections and HIV. The impossibility to maintain essential infrastructure and the rising level of poverty are reflected in the insufficiency of food baskets, absence of proteins, and growing malnutrition rates of children and adults. Humanitarian organizations are unanimously reporting they face problems and impediments in trying to get licenses to deliver food, medicine, vaccines, and other essential goods to the countries under sanctions. The fear of secondary sanctions and de-risking programs used by banks result in growing overcompliance, spreading to donors and transportation companies. In Venezuela in particular, only the involvement of UN agencies like UNICEF and UNDP opened at least the smallest road for humanitarian deliveries. Besides that, women and girls are affected by the impact of unilateral sanctions even more. They are usually the first ones to lose their jobs or to stop their education. Salary of those of them who are working in public sector like hospitals, schools, and social services become very low. They are often get involved into human trafficking, prostitution, sexual exploitation, and abuse, and they are deprived of necessary nutrition, testing, and medical assistance during pregnancy and while delivering babies. Excellencies, we need to admit that unilateral sanctions are not the only reasons for problems faced by the health systems of targeted states. Some of them could have been not sufficiently developed before sanctions were imposed. Some other were affected by pre-existing crises or military conflicts. Some were very much dependent on foreign humanitarian aid, and some face financial problems. However, statistics clearly shows that application of unilateral sanctions has an enormous effect and is changing the entire society to the worse. The health sector is among those which are affected the most. Unfortunately, the impact of unilateral sanctions on different sectors of economy and health systems is not taken into account at the international level while assessing the situation in targeted societies. I would remind here once again that today the negative humanitarian effect of unilateral sanctions is more obvious and more disastrous. Targeted countries have insufficient medical personnel and face shortages of medications and medical equipment, including oxygen supplies and ventilators, protective kits, spare parts, software, fuel, electricity, drinking water. This violates the right to health, the right to food, and the right to life of their populations. Ladies and gentlemen, there is an enormous number of other points of significance which could and shall be discussed as concern the impact of human unilateral sanctions on the national health system. I would use this chance to call once again on states, international organizations, as well as other actors being in position to exercise a positive influence to review and minimize the whole scope of unilateral sanctions in full compliance with obligations arising from the UN Charter, international humanitarian and human rights law, the law of international responsibility, and other international obligations to guarantee that human rights are protected. A preliminary humanitarian assessment analogous to those which is currently done in the environmental area shall always be made before any unilateral measure is taken, even if it's a legal retortion. Under no circumstances should trade in essential humanitarian goods and commodities, such as medicine, antiviral, medical equipment, the accompanying parts and relevant software, as well as food, be subject of any form of direct or indirect unilateral economic measure or sanction. While unilateral sanctions are still not withdrawn, the United Nations Organization, together with the humanitarian NGOs, shall establish and implement the assessment of humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions over targeted countries, similar to the one which exists as regard the UN Security Council sanctions as for vaccination, diseases, salaries, nutrition, mortality rates, and other criteria. Humanitarian concerns shall always prevail over political goals and objectives. While unilateral sanctions remain in force, the whole mechanism of humanitarian aid and humanitarian exceptions shall be amended to facilitate delivery of humanitarian aid rather than to impede its delivery. Unilateral sanctions affect today all spheres of life and every individual in targeted societies, especially women, children, and people in vulnerable situations, infringing their basic rights and endangering their lives. I would like thus to use this chance to call on states and organizations of the UN system, in particular UNICEF, ILO, High Commissioner for Refugees, UNESCO, WHO, and many others, as well as humanitarian NGOs, to control and assess the impact of unilateral sanctions on the situations in targeted societies within the scope of their respected mandates to guarantee well-being of people of targeted societies and to protect their lives. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Elena Dohan, for your presentation. Sorry, because of some technical problems, our moderator cannot connect to webinar. The next speaker will be Mr. Zamir Akram. Mr. Zamir Akram, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this webinar on a very important subject on the impact of unilateral coercive measures on health systems of developing countries. I will be speaking from the perspective of the office that I hold, which is the chair rapporteur of the working group on the right to development. Now, this issue from my perspective is a cross-cutting issue which involves unilateral coercive measures. It involves the issue of health, particularly in the present environment when the world is undergoing this COVID pandemic, and the impact of these on the developing countries, and particularly on the right to development, as we are in the process of engaging on this issue in Geneva, most recently in the last month. So let me begin by speaking about the issue of health and the right to development. Now, health is considered a fundamental human right, and it is universally recognized. It is part of the Declaration, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and is part of the covenants on human rights, especially the one on economic, social, and cultural rights. It is also a part of the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development, which considers access to health as one of its core objectives. Most recently, the unanimous or consensus adoption of the 2030 Development Agenda also recognizes health coverage as one of the sustainable development goals. So the point I want to emphasize is that the issue of health is a fundamental aspect of internationally recognized human rights. And on the reverse side, denial of adequate health is an obstacle to the full realization of human rights, and which includes the right to development. Now, this has been brought sharply into focus by the ongoing COVID pandemic across the world. And in my statement to the 21st session of the Working Group on the Right to Development in May this year, I emphasized that due to the pandemic, gross domestic product has contracted 5.2% in 2020 globally. This has caused the deepest recession in the world over the last 8 decades. The global economy has contracted by 4.5%. 400 million jobs worldwide have been lost, and more than 100 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty. UNCTAD has estimated that an economic aid package of $2.5 trillion is required to curb the pandemic's disastrous impact on developing countries. The pandemic has affected lives and health of groups which are already vulnerable, including women, children, and those living in extreme poverty. In this pandemic, the worst hit countries are, of course, the developing countries, and particularly the least developed countries, which are in need of urgent support. For this, there is an urgent need for global solidarity to overcome the impact of the pandemic, since it is in the long-term interests of all, the developing and the developed countries, the rich and the poor. However, it is unfortunate that this kind of global solidarity has not emerged over the last year since the pandemic has started. Adequate financial and medical support to the developing countries has been below the required levels, as has been acknowledged by the WHO. Some developed countries have been more interested in a blame game rather than in substantive cooperation. The developed countries have also now taken a major share of the COVID vaccines, which have left the developing and least developed countries with serious shortages of vaccines. Another negative impact has been caused by the implementation of universal coercive measures against targeted countries in the areas of health, even at a time when these targeted countries have faced acute difficulties in dealing with the COVID pandemic. With the result that in these targeted countries, vulnerable groups, especially women, children, and the elderly, have been very badly affected. Let me then say a few words about the universal coercive measures and the right to development, which is my core responsibility. Now, the negative impact of universal coercive measures on enjoyment of human rights was recognized by the Human Rights Council when it appointed the Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures in 2014. The United Nations Charter, the mandate of the Human Rights Council, the Vienna Declaration, they are all internationally accepted instruments which stress the universal nature of human rights and fundamental freedoms without discrimination. Without discrimination. However, universal coercive measures do not, unilateral coercive measures do not gel or do not correlate with this very fundamental requirement of without discrimination, of stressing the universal nature of human rights without discrimination. Unilateral coercive measures do not reconcile with the Declaration on the Right to Development of 1986, especially Article 3, which states that countries have the right to cooperate with each other in ensuring development and eliminating the obstacles to development. Unilateral coercive measures run contrary to this Article 3 in the Declaration on the Right to Development. Now, as a result of a decision by the Human Rights Council in 2019, the working group has begun consideration in May, as I mentioned this last session, of a legally binding instrument or a convention on the right to development. This decision of the Human Rights Council called upon the chair rapporteur, that is me, to appoint and work with a group of experts to prepare a draft legally binding instrument. And in keeping with the discussions that have taken place over the years in the working group on the right to development, in the context of unilateral coercive measures, this draft legally binding instrument that we have now prepared and which is now before member countries includes a very specific reference in a specific article to the issue of unilateral coercive measures and their negative impact on the right to development. So this, as I said, is a draft that has been put forward. It is now before the international community, before member states of the United Nations. And we now have to see in the next meeting of the working group, which is due to be held in November this year, on the measures, on the way forward and the steps to be taken for the final adoption and conclusion of this Convention on the Right to Development, which will include stipulations against the practice of unilateral coercive measures. So my time is up. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Akram. You have made a very good case against the use of unilateral coercive measures. We would welcome the adoption of the Convention on the Right to Development whenever bodies. Now, our third distinguished essay and the Center for Excellence in Education for Sustainable Development, both based at the university. She is also a member of the Cultural Heritage Law Committee of the International Association and has acted as an international consultant to UNESCO since 1999, mostly in the field of intangible cultural heritage and implementing the 2003 convention. Dr. Janet Blake has published books on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, cultural rights and diversity, and wildlife protection law, and several articles have been on safeguarding human rights and cultural rights, cultural diversity, and sustainable development. Her research monograph on international cultural heritage law was published by the Oxford University Press in June 2015. Dr. Janet Blake, you are welcome to make your case.
Well, thank you very much, esteemed Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank the co-sponsors of this event for inviting me to participate in this webinar that addresses a topic of great and increasing importance today. And I should say that it is an honor and possibly a challenge to follow two such well-qualified speakers. Legally highly dubious and condemned by the Human Rights Council in 2014, unilateral coercive measures, UCMs, constitute an invidious attack on the rights of the citizens of the targeted countries on whom they have a disproportionate impact and represent a form of collective punishment. An unwarranted intervention in the internal affairs of the state. UCMs are a form of war waged through the international economic system. And just as traditional wars destroy the physical, social, economic, and even cultural fabric of society, so sanctions, even smart ones, severely damage the social and economic rights of the populations of these countries. And contrary to being a legitimate countermeasure for an injured state under the law of state responsibility, UCMs are an attack on the three main pillars of the UN Charter, namely peace and security, development, and human rights. And of course, peace, security, and development are all prerequisites for the guarantee of human rights. And UCMs force sanctioned countries into a situation where it becomes impossible for them fully to protect the human rights of their citizens, including their rights to health and well-being. And I feel that well-being is an extremely apt concept to use here, since it sums up the many dimensions of people's lives that are implicated in guaranteeing the right to health, especially of individuals with multiple vulnerabilities. Of course, rights related to health are some of the worst affected human rights by unilateral sanctions. And this brings me to three important aspects of the right to health. First, as has just been mentioned, and foremost, as with all human rights, it is universal. It applies to all persons in all places at all times. Second, the human right to health depends upon the guarantee of a number of human rights, of all categories of human right. And this interdependence of human rights was set out in the 1968 Tehran Proclamation on Human Rights, and of course affirmed by the 1993 Vienna Declaration, which remains today a very important international instrument. And to take a few examples of the range implicated in supporting the right to health, of course, in addition to access to basic health care and services and the right to life, we have among the civil and political rights, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of information, and among the social and cultural rights, we have the right to family life, the right to social security, rights related to education, and the enjoyment of the benefit of scientific advances. And when I mention the rights related to education, I would like just to point out that I'm sure this is an experience shared by other countries that have been placed under such sanctions regimes, that Iranian academics many have been prevented from publishing in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and certainly my students have for many years had great problems accessing these journals. And this is yet another way in which human rights, including the right to health, are seriously damaged and impacted by UCMs. And third, many vulnerable individuals suffer from multiple human rights challenges. And it is this effect of multiple vulnerabilities which is really so important here. For example, it is bad enough to face the impact of sanctions if you're a single mother with 2 children. But if you're already living on the edge of poverty and one of your children is disabled, it is, of course, a far greater challenge. And I would also like to point out that the impacts of UCMs on the right to health are not just on the present generation, but these impacts can continue into future generations. For example, we know very well that the nutritional status of mothers is extremely important for the future health of their children. And I mean, I almost hesitate to enter the area of development following from Zamir Akram, but I will do so. UCMs also affect the ability of a sanctioned state to set and to implement its own internal policies. Of course, important part of the right to self-determination, including those that would support its right to development, which Mohammed Bejayi called the alpha and omega of human rights. In the view of Mohammed Bejayi, in fact, who the ex-president of the International Court of Justice, amongst other roles that he played, it's not simply the right to self-determination that has this status, but the right to development also. And it is perhaps worth noting that the supporters of the right to development have traditionally been countries of the global south, while those that have habitually employed UCMs are from the global north. And this points to a divergence of viewpoint as to the values on which human rights are based that is highly relevant to today's discussion and is worthy of further examination. And the seriousness of the challenge posed by UCMs to the right to development becomes even more obvious if we place it in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. As we know, SDG 17 calls on the international community to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. And we should remember also that the 17 SDGs are viewed as interlinked and should be achieved together, just as human rights are interdependent on each other. So hence, SDG 17 relates also to achieving the goals of good health and well-being, which is SDG 2, gender equality, SDG 5, and reduced inequalities, SDG 10, to name but a few that are highly relevant to supporting the right to health. It becomes clear from this that UCMs not only create an immediate obstacle towards achieving several key SDGs relating to the health and well-being of women, girls, and vulnerable persons, but in place of UCMs, states are acting in contradiction to the whole of the Agenda 2030. And although this is a soft law instrument, it carries a great authority, having the support of the whole international community. And there is increasing evidence that sustainable development has become more than simply a goal and is actually a legal principle by which states are expected to operate. Unfortunately, as we have seen, demonstrating the illegality of UCMs under international law has not in itself been sufficient to deal with this essentially political strategy. We should recall that the UN General Assembly called for multilateral cooperation and solidarity in the face of COVID-19 in Resolution 74-270. And given that this pandemic is a global crisis and can only be responded to through global solidarity, this illustrates starkly how UCMs are not just damaging to the targeted countries and their vulnerable populations in particular, but they also damage the global common good. Now, perhaps this may be the turning point in history, when it becomes sufficiently obvious that all states need to respect this call for solidarity and to refrain from politically motivated and illegal UCMs, that we can really challenge this pernicious practice. However, as has been mentioned already, recent experience with regard to sharing vaccines has not been overly encouraging. So I apologize for ending on a slightly downbeat tone, but I hope that this meeting and others will lay the ground for future action that can bring us to a more positive place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blake. I think we have a good understanding now of the challenges that unilateral coercive measures pose on world development and the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. Perhaps, Dr. Blake, I would also add that UCMs are counterproductive in as far as realizing Goal 16 is concerned. The whole question of inclusive development. You have to make an input into this very important discussion. Your Excellencies, you have 4 to 5 minutes when called upon to make your remarks. I'll start with Belarus. His Excellency, Mr. Valentin Rybakov. Apologies for the poor pronunciation. The permanent representative of Belarus. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today at this very important event. This issue of unilateral coercive measures and the impact of such measures on human rights have been in the focus of the United Nations system for decades. Multiple discussions, resolutions, reports presented to the General Assembly, to the Human Rights Council, to the former Commission on Human Rights, have all addressed the issue of UCM's negative impact on the full enjoyment of human rights. It has been very well established that UCMs are inconsistent with international law, create obstacles to trade, and impede the full realization of human rights. The challenges put forth by the COVID-19 global pandemic exacerbate the already grave situation with UCMs. At the time when we need to talk about unity and mutual support, unilateral coercive measures continue to pose a growing threat to many countries across the globe, and also to hit the hardest, the least protected groups in those countries. The purpose of our event today is exactly in raising the awareness of the detrimental effects of the UCMs, particularly on health and well-being of women, children, persons with disabilities, and persons in vulnerable situations. On the eve of the global pandemic, the United Nations General Assembly in 2019, in its political declaration on universal health coverage, consensually reaffirmed the right of every human being, without any distinction of any kind, to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. At the same time, UCMs have both direct and indirect implications that create dire conditions, restricting or limiting the ability of targeted health systems to respond to health issues. The UN Special Rapporteur on the UCMs provided strong evidence how UCMs lead to lack or insufficiency of medicines and vaccines, the termination of construction of hospitals and primary healthcare centers, and also to the reduction of healthcare services provided by the governments. Belarus has been on the receiving end of such unlawful measures, especially since August 2020, following the presidential elections in my country. We have been consistently standing against the practice of using UCMs as a foreign policy instrument and have been promoting their unconditional eradication. Belarus continues to support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the UCMs on the enjoyment of human rights, whose work is essential to attain greater understanding of the damage UCMs cause to people and nations across the globe. We also fully support the initiative of Venezuela to form an association against unilateral coercive measures. We are ready to join this initiative and to support its activities. I thank you all for your attention and for attending this important event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency Valentin Rybakov, the permanent representative of Belarus. We have heard you loud and clear. I would like also to recognize the expression of interest that has been made by the Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan, Ambassador Ami Khan, who would like to take the floor, and Zimbabwe. We have taken note. We shall be inviting you shortly. I now would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Zhang Jun, the permanent representative of China to the UN. Your Excellency, please take the floor.
Well, dear Mr. Moderator, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, let me start by thanking Ambassador Majid for initiating this very, very timely and important event. And China is also very glad that we are co-sponsoring this event. I also wish to give my heartfelt appreciation to Elena, Zamir, and Zenit for your very, very thought-provoking briefing and the sharing of your analysis on the impact of UCMs on the health and the fundamental rights of people which are under sanctions. I do share many, many of your points. Well, yes, indeed, as we have heard from colleagues, the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over. What's unfortunate is that at this critical juncture, unilateral coercive measures imposed by some countries are still in place, undermining global response and threatening the health of people of targeted countries. Unilateral sanctions are illegal, unjustified, and unreasonable. While the pandemic is natural, unilateral sanction is man-made and turning a health crisis into a humanity crisis. So it's our view that UCMs violate international law. The UN Charter stipulates that states have the duty to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. And no state should apply domestic law to exercise long-arm jurisdiction over other countries. Such practices seriously violate the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter, the fundamental principle of sovereign equality in international law, and the basic principle of non-interference in international relations. What should be pointed out is that Some countries are even using unilateral sanctions to suppress legitimate governments of other states and incite the so-called color revolution and regime change. Some countries are also using UCMs as tools for unfair economic and scientific competitions. There is no doubt the law of the jungle as such contradicts the trend of democracy in international relations and should be discarded by history. It's also our view that UCMs result in human rights crisis. According to UN reports, as the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated, no high values could justify the violation of fundamental human rights, including the right to life, the right to health, and the right to food. The global health crisis caused by COVID-19 has revealed the depths of the problem and shows clearly that UCMs can be deadly, especially for women, children, the elderly, and other vulnerable groups and the population. It's obvious that trade ban, investment restriction, market disruption, and other UCMs imposed by the US and other Western countries are severely undermining economic development and people's livelihood in targeted countries. Some Western countries impose UCMs in the name of democracy and human rights protection. But what we are seeing is that the systematic violation of basic human rights. It's time that such hypocritical tricks come to an end. It's also our view that UCMs worsen humanitarian crises. The Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights have repeatedly called for the lifting of unilateral sanctions to meet humanitarian needs. In reality, humanitarian assistance and trade in goods, such as medical equipment and parts, software, drug, and food, is constantly interrupted or restricted. Some countries keep talking about international humanitarian law, but they never implement them. This is nothing but politicization and a double standard. A just cause enjoys abundant support, while an unjust one finds little. Unilateral sanctions are strongly opposed by the international community. The UNGA has adopted resolutions against the unilateral economic measures as a means of political and economic coercion against the developing countries every 2 years since 1989. On necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the US against Cuba each year since 1992, and on human rights and the unilateral coercive measures each year since 1997. Among the 16 communications publicized by the Special Rapporteur on UCMs, 12 are addressed to the US. So we urge the US and some other Western countries to listen to the overwhelming voice of the international community, lift the UCMs, uphold global solidarity against the pandemic, and practice true multilateralism. We urge all countries to abide by the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter, uphold true multilateralism, and the international order underpinned by international law. The social systems and the development paths independently chosen by people of all countries based on their national conditions should be fully respected. We should strongly oppose hegemonism and bullying practices. China will continue to stand on the side of true multilateralism, the majority of the member states, and fairness and justice. China will continue to do whatever we can in helping other countries to fight the pandemic. We call for international solidarity and cooperation to win an early victory against the pandemic and strive to build a community of shared future and health for all. And I also hope that we, while having this webinar, we do translate our strong voice into actions as proposed by our briefers. We do need to take more action to end those unilateral coercive measures. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Mr. Zhang Jun, the permanent representative of China to the United Nations. You have really underscored the importance of international solidarity, multilateralism, and the need to act in solidarity with each other in dealing not only with the pandemic, but with global problems. Your Excellency, you speak to my mandate as the independent expert on promoting a democratic and equitable international order. I thank you. I now would like to invite His Excellency, Mr. Pedro Luis Pedros Cuesta. Apologies for the poor pronunciation of the name. Who is the permanent representative of Cuba to the United Nations. And before Your Excellency speaks, please allow me to take note of the expression of interest that has been made by His Excellency David Kina, who is the first secretary to the UK mission to the UN, would like to speak. We have taken note of your expression of interest, and we shall be inviting you shortly. I would also like to take note of the expression of interest to speak by Councillor Simon Popan on behalf of the European Union. We shall be inviting you shortly as well to speak. Your Excellency, the permanent representative of Cuba, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I thank Mr. Livingstone Senguarana, UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. It is a pleasure to see you moderating this very timely panel. I also thank the panelists for their thorough presentations. Dear colleagues, national health systems are among the most impacted sectors by the imposition of unilateral coercive measures. Hence, we are of the view that the holding of this webinar is of utmost importance. Unilateral coercive measures are contrary to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. They pose a major obstacle to development of the countries upon which are imposed, and their primary objective is often to pull out concessions from developing countries and undermine their right to self-determination. The impact of these measures on national health systems eloquently expose their criminal character and their devastating consequences on the well-being of the peoples against which they are applied, and particularly on the quality of life of the most vulnerable. It has been duly documented that these measures have a direct and indirect impact on the performance of national health systems and the provision of health care services. On the one hand, they impede the purchase of medicines, equipment, technologies, and supplies indispensable for health care at an unmensurable human cost. On the other hand, they hamper the performance of vital public services, such as power generation and fuel supply, without which national health services cannot operate normally or efficiently. This reality has been denounced over and over again by the countries that suffered the unjust imposition of these measures. However, the inhumane essence of these practices have never been so exposed as during the COVID-19 pandemic. In an international context as complex as the COVID-19 pandemic, in which the spirit of solidarity and international cooperation and the most basic sense of humanism should prevail, we can confirm that this type of measures, which contravene international law, have continued to be applied with full severity, and in some cases, such as that of Cuba, they have even been strengthened. The appeals made by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Nations Secretary General on March 23rd and 26th, 2020, respectively, to lift these measures in the context of the pandemic have been overtly ignored. On the contrary, and as it has been documented by the Special Rapporteur on the negative impacts of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, the frequency, type, purpose, and scope of application of these measures have been enormously broadened. Cuba is a clear example of this reality. My country continues to be subjected to the lengthiest set of unilateral coercive measures in history. For more than 60 decades, and without interruption, Cuba has had to suffer the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States. This policy of punishment against Cuba, which is nothing else but a crime, constitutes a massive, flagrant, and systematic violation of the human rights of the Cuban people. It violates the UN Charter and international law, and it is the main hindrance to my country's socioeconomic development and to our government's effort to improve the quality of life of the population. The accumulated damages in nearly 6 decades of application of these policies amount to over $147.8 billion. On top of that, COVID-19 pandemic has been the context chosen by the US government to further intensify in an unprecedented manner its criminal behavior against Cuba. Between April and December 2020, the blockade caused losses to Cuba in the order of $3.5 billion, which, added to the losses of the previous year, amounts to a total of over $9.1 billion from April 2019 to December 2020. The blockade poses a colossal burden to the Cuban people and economy, with particularly ravaging effects within the context of the pandemic of COVID-19, in which Cuba has had to allocate considerable resources to urgently ensure the necessary equipment and materials for its national health system. The refusal of international suppliers to deliver the agreed commodities, the delays in the arrival of supplies, and the increase in costs resulted in losses in this area amounting to $198,348,000 between April and December 2020. This shows an increase of $38 million with respect to the previous period. Cuba was unable to access a total of 32 equipments and supplies related to the production of vaccine candidates against the COVID-19 pandemic, or to the implementation of stages that allow for the completion of the vaccine clinical studies, including equipment for the purification of vaccine candidates, accessories for the production equipment, filtration tanks and capsules, potassium chloride solution, thimerosal, and reagents. This had an impact on the work of several institutions on the Cuban pharmaceutical industry, including the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, the Finland Vaccine Institute, the ICA Laboratories Company, and the Pharmacuba Company directly linked to the country's effort to tackle the pandemic. In like manner, the blockade has repeatedly obstructed the arrival of humanitarian aid in the country, which is immoral and unjustifiable in the context of the fight against the pandemic, and reveals the criminal essence of the blockade. Despite these enormous obstacles and limitations, Cuba's efforts in confronting the pandemic have been internationally recognized. The country has 5 vaccine candidates in development, is about to become the first Latin American country to have its own vaccine and to vaccinate its entire population. In addition, it has sent 57 medical brigades to support the fight against the pandemic in 40 countries and territories. The aim of the blockade is to bring the Cuban people to their knees and to make us to abandon the path that we have chosen in the exercise of our self-determination. However, the United States will fail as it has failed for 6 decades in its ambitions against Cuba, because our people remained firm and united in the objective of building a fairer and more inclusive society for all. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Of Cuba to ensure that this blockade is actually lifted. At this juncture, I would like now to invite the permanent representative to the United Nations of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Your Excellency, Mr. Majid Tak Ravash. Apologies for the poor pronunciation of your name. Please, you have the floor. Please, Excellencies, be reminded that we have very limited time left. Each of you should at least spend not more than 4 minutes. Your Excellency, the permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the United Nations, you have the floor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mr. Sevaniana. Dear colleagues, friends, I would like to begin by expressing my thanks to the panelists for their interesting and informative statements. Unilateral coercive measures, including sanctions, are unlawful, immoral, and inhumane. They flagrantly violate international law and utterly breach basic human rights. As one of the first countries hit by a severe outbreak of COVID-19, the Islamic Republic of Iran is simultaneously facing decades-long sanctions. These illegal measures have drastically deterred firms, banks, and financial institutions from engaging in commercial and financial transactions with Iran. The so-called humanitarian exemption that we often hear from Western officials is but a mere deception and duplicity. Such exemptions are in fact designed to remain merely on paper. The consequences of such sanctions pose a serious threat to Iranians' right to health and access to essential medicines, medical equipment and supplies, pharmaceutical products and health commodities. The United States' current economic terrorism further inflicts severe suffering on Iranian individuals who are afflicted with a range of diseases and medical conditions, resulting annually in the death of many Iranians, including innocent women and children. In practice, sanctions target the most vulnerable the most. Some of the worst affected individuals are those with rare diseases requiring a specialized treatment, who are unable to acquire previously available medicines as their import is prevented as a result of sanctions. These include people with different or rare forms of cancers, EB, a debilitating lifelong condition that causes fragile and blistering skin, individuals in the need of chemotherapy medications, as well as veterans with chronic injuries from exposure to chemical weapons during Saddam's imposed war on Iran. To show how sanctions impact our citizens, I want to read a summary of a letter by Yasna, an Iranian girl affected by sanctions. And I quote, "I am 6.5 years old. I've been suffering from seizures since I was 6 months old. I've been taking 4 types of medicines, 2 of which are US made. However, when in recent years, American politicians decided to further tighten the sanctions against Iran, the import of such medicines stopped and my family could no longer provide me with the medicine I needed. As a result, my illness worsened and worsened, leading to many seizures, due to which I lost 99% of my speech and 90% of my decision-making power. Now I can no longer behave like my peers. While children my age go to school, play and have fun, unfortunately my entertainment, my upbringing, my dreams, my future, and literally my life have been destroyed by a simple decision of a politician who decided to sanction our country." End of quote. Jeopardizing the health and safety of entire populations for political ends is not only illegal, but a war crime and crime against humanity, entailing international responsibility. We have the ethical responsibility to strongly oppose sanctions and call for their immediate removal. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the permanent representative of Iran to the United Nations. I think Iran, like Cuba, are facing very serious sanctions, and the effect of those sanctions is definitely very detrimental to the plight of the vulnerable people. Now, I would like to invite the permanent representative of Nicaragua to the United Nations, His Excellency, Mr. Jaime Hamida Castillo. Mr. Castillo, you have the floor. Permanent representative of Nicaragua to the United Nations. The permanent representative of Nicaragua to the UN. Are you there? Okay, looks like His Excellency Mr. Jaime Hamida Castillo doesn't seem to be responding. In the meantime, can I invite His Excellency Mr. Bassam Sabag, who is the permanent representative of Syria to the United Nations. Your Excellency, Mr. Bassam Sabag, are you there?
Yes.
Hello?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, Your Excellency. Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Shwayana, Excellency. Let me first thank the distinguished colleagues for their interventions and the esteemed briefers for their valuable inputs today. In the interest of time, I will be concise. Unilateral coercive measures have and continue to catastrophically impact the economic developments of targeted countries, gravely violate their population's right to life and health, and severely impede their access to health services, particularly their ability to purchase life-saving medical equipment. Such measures have leave devastating impacts on women, children, persons with disabilities, and other people in vulnerable situations. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in the beginning of last year has represented a global health threat and serious challenge to all member states, and a greater and more serious to countries targeted by unilateral coercive measures in particular. In this regard, we stress that COVAX facility alone will not be sufficient to ensure overcoming the pandemic in our countries. Therefore, my delegation calls for universal, equitable, accelerated, and affordable access to vaccines, screening equipment, and healthcare services. Since the beginning of the pandemic, my country has undertaken all preventive measures, including through cooperation with several international organizations which were hindered by the imposition of UCM. Some countries continued to impose, extend, and expand such measures without giving any consideration to their negative impacts on people and all sectors in my country, including the health sector. These measures caused shortage of medical, preventive, and therapeutic equipment needed to deal with the pandemic in targeted countries and hinder their availability in a timely manner. In this venue, my country's ability to purchase targeted medical equipment such as MRIs, CAT scan, ultrasound machines that contribute to the early detection of breast cancer, for example, is highly impeded. Moreover, purchasing the much needed medications for women and children cancers is met with many obstacles, leaving them in a dire situation. In this regard, US expanded its use of the UCM, and the threat of use thereof, especially through considering new kind of sanctions, such as the imposition of the so-called Caesar Act on Syria in 2019. Let me also point out that EU recently renewed the unilateral inhuman coercive measures against Syria, therefore affecting the Syrian citizens in their health and livelihood, and constituting a flagrant violation of the most basic human rights and principles of international humanitarian law. Let me make it clear to you, colleagues, that any mentioning of the so-called humanitarian exemption are merely an illusion created to divert the attention of public opinion from the unjust reality caused by these measures. In this regard, we appreciated the reflection of Ms. Dohan, the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of UCMs on the enjoyment of human rights, in her latest report of this fact. In conclusion, the negative impact of COVID-19 on the population of targeted countries, especially women, children, persons with disabilities, continue to be a challenge to global solidarity and multilateralism. Therefore, my country will continue to advocate the right and aspiration of the Syrian people and the other 2 billion people subject to these unjust and illegal measures. We also reiterate the call made by the UN Secretary General and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for countries imposing UCMs to waive them in order to help certain targeted countries get their much needed medical supplies. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the permanent representative of Syria to the United Nations, Your Excellency Bassam Sabag. We have heard you loud and clear, and I hope this meeting will take note of the various issues that you have raised that have a bearing on the Syrian people. At this time, I want to recognize that Nicaragua has now joined the webinar. I now want to invite once again the permanent representative of Nicaragua to the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Jamey Hamida Castillo, to take the floor. Your Excellency, you have the floor. Your Excellency Hamida Castillo, are you there? Okay. May I now move to while awaiting? Hello? Okay, Your Excellency, the permanent representative of Nicaragua, you are welcome. You have the floor, Your Excellency. Hello, I don't hear you. Hello, Your Excellency, I don't hear you.
Venezuela. Call Venezuela.
Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, now I hear you. Wonderful.
Oh, thank you, dear moderator. We're sorry for these technological issues that we're having. Mr. Moderator, our thanks to the delegation of Iran for proposing and organizing this webinar on the impact of unilateral coercive measures on national health system in developing countries. Our solidarity with families who have lost loved ones and with those who suffer the consequences of COVID-19. Our appreciation to the panelists, Alina, Samir, Janet, and previous speaker for sharing all these facts and information on how these sanctions are affecting more than 1 billion people, especially children, women, elderly, and vulnerable persons. The pandemic has exacerbated even more the great existing crisis of poverty, hunger, and malnutrition, inequality, unemployment, and climate change, as a result of the current unjust and degrading economic system. By affecting all countries, the pandemic has clearly shown the urgent need to create a new international economic model based on inclusion, solidarity, equity, social justice, prioritizing health as a universal right of humanity, demanding that the resources that are destined for war to be used for life and peace. All the effort of developing countries for our sustainable development are undermined by the imposition of unilateral coercive measures, illegal sanctions, actions that are criminal aggression against our people and life itself, and negatively impact all national programs and action to implement the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. It is imperative that the immediate elimination of any coercive unilaterally economic measure imposed on our people by some powerful countries. In times of pandemic, this UCM becomes a crime against humanity. In accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations, the international community must adopt urgent measures to eliminate the use of these criminal economic coercive measures to ensure that the effectiveness of national responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and to strengthen our health system and the protection of our people. Our gratitude and recognition to those countries that are unconditionally helping us to overcome and defeat this pandemic, providing medical assistance and equipment, with donation of vaccine, sharing medical and technological knowledge, and especially to Cuba, that despite suffering the imposition of a criminal blockade and this UCM, Cuba continues to provide its eternal solidarity to all countries in need, including developing countries, as we have seen during this pandemic. Dear moderator, to conclude, we also want to express our solidarity to all peoples or countries that are suffering these criminal sanctions and economic unilateral measures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the permanent representative of Syria to the United Nations. I think you have underscored the fact that unilateral coercive measures amount to a breach of international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. I now would like to invite His Excellency, the permanent representative of Venezuela to the United Nations, His Excellency, Mr. Samuel Moncada. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Ambassador Ravanchi, allow me to congratulate you for the organization of this webinar and to express my appreciation to the panelists for their valuable presentations. Excellencies, unilateral coercive measures are acts of economic warfare that prevent entire nations from using essential goods and services to sustain health or life. They are tools for projecting national power in order to dominate through pain, suffering, and economic destruction independent states. For this reason, unilateral coercive measures violate the purposes of the UN Charter. Furthermore, their extraterritorial character contravenes the principle of sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of states, while deliberately undermining the whole system of international relations. Even amid the worst pandemic in a century, We witness today how the aggressor countries are expanding the destructive power of their instruments of coercion. For instance, last year, the United States of America, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and Japan reformed their legal and institutional frameworks for strengthening their coordination and capabilities to impose far more destructive coercive regimes. We are talking about an international network to illegally exercise coercion on independent and sovereign countries. We are on the threshold of a new generation of coercive actions that will only fuel confrontation on a planetary scale. These widespread measures, given their scope and destructive nature, will have a devastating impact on the life and health of 1/3 of humanity. This new generation of unilateral coercive measure is the next level of silent weapons of mass destruction. Excellencies, in the field of public health, we find that before the pandemic, the collective suffering caused by legal coercive measures was already increasing the morbidity and mortality of entire populations, while exacerbating the deprivations of women, children, and other persons in vulnerable situations. However, in 2020, when the pandemic began to be used deliberately as an advantage for aggression, the legal measures have become true crimes against humanity. For the Venezuelan public health system, the destructive effect of this strategy of economic coercion has caused, among others, the following damages: the blockade of funds to be used for the import of insulin doses and supplies for dialysis, the blockade of purchase orders for laboratory reagents, medical equipment, immunosuppressants, antiretrovirals, serological, antimicrobial, and fungal tests, vaccines, surgical material, and other medicines, as well as the blockade of financial transactions for the procurement and maintenance of neurosurgery equipment, pacemakers, prostheses, hemodynamics, radiology, and radiotherapy. On top of that, we must add the aggression that currently deprives the Venezuelan people from medical supplies to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a strategy of calculated cruelty against millions of people. It is a crime against humanity. Excellency, a couple of days ago, the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, said, quote, "A defining characteristic of the pandemic is the lack of sharing of information, technologies, and resources. A treaty would foster improved sharing, trust, and accountability, and provide a solid foundation on which to build other mechanisms for global health security. What Dr. Tedros proposes is a treaty for ensuring equity in the access to the means for dealing with the pandemic. Should this be achieved, the treaty would create an international framework free from illegal unilateral coercive measures. From Venezuela, we support Dr. Tedros in his world vision. In the meantime, though, we need short-term solutions in order to fulfill the most urgent needs of our peoples. In a more practical approach, we consider that time has come for concluding agreements among willing states, among truly international law-abiding states, in order to create common mechanisms out of reach of illegal coercive measures for liberating our capacities for protecting the health of our peoples. Something smaller than a world treaty, but with faster effects on the ground. An agreement of this nature would establish an international channel free from illegal coercive measures that would release a flow of legal transactions currently blocked, increasing our ability to reach health security. We are proposing a platform for coordinating mutually beneficial economic, commercial, and financial strategies to enable all willing nations, particularly those affected by unilateral coercive measures, to work together with international law and the UN Charter. This is our concrete proposal. Time for action is now. Thank you, Your Excellencies.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the permanent representative of Venezuela to the United Nations, Mr. Samuel Moncada. Your Excellency, you have introduced a very interesting notion in international law, which is calculated cruelty. And definitely, unilateral coercive measures are deliberate and cause a lot of harm and are inconsistent with international law and the UN Charter. The idea of a platform, I think, is a good one, which member states should examine. I thank you, Your Excellency, for your remarks. I would like now to invite His Excellency, the Chargé d'Affaires of Zimbabwe, to the United Nations, His Excellency, Mr. Patronela Nyagura. Patronela Nyagura, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellent.
Oh, sorry, Madam Patronela.
Thank you. Excellencies and dear colleagues, I would like to join excellencies that have spoken before me in thanking the panelists for their candid and well-articulated presentations that really laid bare the damaging impacts of UCMs. Zimbabwe is pleased to co-host this webinar on the impact of unilateral coercive measures on national health systems. UCMs are by their very nature contrary to the principles of the UN Charter and are a violation of international law. Furthermore, UCMs impede the right to development, economic cooperation, and the development of a non-discriminating multilateral trading system. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the debilitating impacts of the UCMs on the most vulnerable countries and societies by hindering their ability to adequately respond to the pandemic and to access life-saving vaccines and other medical supplies and interventions. In the case of Zimbabwe, UCMs were illegally imposed in reprisal of the government's land redistribution program aimed at redressing historical injustices against the indigenous people of Zimbabwe. These illegal measures resulted in the loss of access to credit line facilities, decline in balance of payment support, resulted in arrears, triggered penalties, a sustained decline in long-term capital, and the loss of external markets and financial aid, a deliberate strategy by some Western countries to hamstring our economy. Hence, the measures have had unprecedented negative impacts on all sectors of the economy, including the national health sector. The rights and well-being of ordinary Zimbabweans is already been highlighted, especially women, children, persons living with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups have also been severely affected. Due to these illegal and politically motivated measures, government's ability to source funds to stimulate economic growth and to provide social safety nets to the most vulnerable has been constrained. The private sector has equally been affected. Sanctions have also had a negative impact on the quality of health delivery services in Zimbabwe. The country has experienced shortages of drugs, inadequate medical infrastructure, low morale amongst medical personnel, leading to brain drain as qualified personnel left Zimbabwe for greener pastures. Furthermore, they inhibit Zimbabwe from accessing adequate resources needed for the prevention and treatment of HIV, making it difficult for ordinary Zimbabweans to access affordable healthcare services, particularly antiretroviral drugs for HIV and AIDS. Furthermore, they've also led to the withdrawal of donor support to projects aimed at improving water and sanitation, thus compromising efforts by government to improve the general living conditions of the ordinary people across the country, particularly the most marginalized communities. The devastating effects of UCMs are well documented by the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of UCMs on the enjoyment of human rights. As far back as 2016, the Special Rapporteur observed that those who imposed the UCMs claimed that the measures were meant to uphold human rights in targeted countries. However, evidence shows that UCMs often undermine basic human rights indiscriminately. The Special Rapporteur also noted that in some cases, the UCMs have caused unwarranted deaths by denying patients access to treatment. In other cases, many people have lost their jobs. Women, the youth, other vulnerable groups like children, the elderly, and the disabled are severely affected by sanctions. Convinced that unilateral coercive measures have a huge impact on the national health systems of targeted countries, the SG and other senior UN officials called for the removal of these measures on the affected countries to enable them to adequately respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, the pandemic exposed the hypocrisy of these countries that impose unjust UCMs on other states, given that diseases and other pestilences know no boundaries. The measures have driven millions deeper into poverty and prevented the very people they purport to protect from realizing fundamental rights. The United Nations should start thinking about how to address this important issue of UCMs, given the intransigent views of those proponents of UCMs, especially now that we strive to achieve SDGs in a post-COVID-19 era, and in terms of ensuring that no one is left behind. In conclusion, Mr. Moderator, the notion that UCMs against any country are targeted in nature must be dismissed. Entire populations in the targeted countries are facing the brunt of these illegal measures. Therefore, I join other progressive and like-minded countries in calling for their immediate and unconditional lifting. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, the Chargé d'Affaires of Zimbabwe to the United Nations, Madame Petronella. I think you have made a compelling case about the negative effects of unilateral coercive measures and the debilitating effect that it has had on the Zimbabwean population. I now would like to invite His Excellency, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia to the United Nations, His Excellency Dmitry Shumakov, to make your remark. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Please,
Sayana.
take very limited time.
Thank you. I have a speech. I wanted to brief it. I wanted to start with the Cuba. You know, especially difficult we think it is that Cuban medical teams, medical brigades are famous all over the world. And it's such a pity. Sorry, we have technical problem with echo. Yeah, and it's such a pity that the sanctions limit the ability of Cuban medical brigades to help other countries. Because, of course, as to our brotherly Cuban people, it is a very big tragedy. But a limitation of helping other countries is even more precarious. Now, back to my topics. I wanted to say that we thank the Iranian delegation for the initiative of today's event. It is very valuable and important. And of course, this reminds us of the cost of the UCMs, of these hostilities, and lead to increase of incidents in all the countries we have discussed today. And we thank the briefer from Ms. Elena Dohan for a valuable input. We hope that she will continue to alert people, international community to the problems. We also recognize that some Western scientific and even government circles Different voices are now heard on the disproportionate burden of sanctions imposed on ordinary people. I recall here, for example, the report of the US Government Accountability Office dated February 21, which with reference to the partner organizations of the US Agency for International Development confirmed that some negative effect on the supply of humanitarian aid to Venezuela. In September 2020, a study was published in the European Journal of Public Health on the negative impact of sanctions on health and health system in low and middle income countries. Critical articles, of course, are published quite regularly by mainstream American press, New York Times, Washington Post, Nation, on worsening situation on Iran's health system. Also, let me remind you about that letters were sent to President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson, signed by more than 90 outstanding political, academic, religious representatives with a request to lift the anti-Syrian sanctions. This letter explicitly states that there is consensus in the human rights and humanitarian environment that this form of collective punishment of civilian populations is leading Syria to unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. And third and last point, our country will continue to use all available opportunities to induce the world community to resist the policy of illegal sanctions, including through growing cooperation with sanctioned states to combat the coronavirus epidemic. We also call on responsible states to support the mandate of the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on unilateral sanctions. We also record a lot of GA resolutions that we have adopted in the GA on this topic, and we really need to continue to think how to implement the initiative, the proposal by our president to establish green corridors free from sanctions and trade wars in order to win the pandemic. I thank you very much for your attention, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the Russian Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN. I think you have made a very compelling case in favor of Syria, Iran, and Cuba and other countries that face sanctions. And I think it's high time, as you rightly put it, that there is a concerted effort for UN member states to address the problem. I now would like to invite the Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the United Nations, Your Excellency Ami Khan. Please, Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank the organizers for arranging this event on this important issue of universal coercive measures and their impact on the health of individuals with multiple vulnerabilities. I also wish to thank the three panelists for the very insightful remarks and the consequences that universal coercive measures have generated, not only on the economies of the countries which have been targeted, but also on the enjoyment of human rights of the people in the targeted countries. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to severely affect all nations, in particular developing countries. However, we continue to witness the application of unilateral coercive measures, which are contrary to the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and international law, multilateralism, and the basic norms of international relations. I think this point has been well made by Dr. Blake today in her presentation. And I also want to thank Ms. Dohan for her remarks, especially highlighting how UCMs are having a profound negative impact on the enjoyment of right to health, food, and life of the population in the targeted countries, which is indeed a barrier to the enjoyment of fundamental human rights. And Ambassador Akram, in his presentation, spoke at length the impact in the form of loss of livelihoods and the contraction of economies. This has really amplified the health and economic woes of poor developing countries, which are already worst hit by COVID pandemic. It is against this backdrop that the UN Secretary General and UN High Commissioner have repeatedly urged member states to cooperate and to withdraw, review, or minimize all unilateral sanctions, undermining the ability of the targeted states to respond effectively to the pandemic crisis and to save lives. The UN High Commissioner on Human Rights have particularly raised alarm on the use of so-called sectoral sanctions, which have negative impacts on the healthcare and the human rights of vulnerable people. As a member of the Group of 77 and China and non-alignment movement, we have persistently opposed the use of unilateral coercive measures and also called for their elimination to ensure the effectiveness of national responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the United Nations, Ambassador Ami Khan. You have reiterated the necessity for us to address the issue of unilateral coercive measures, given that they continue to impact negatively on the economic and social well-being of the people in the affected countries. I would now like to invite His Excellency, the First Secretary, David Kinner, of the UK Permanent Mission to the United Nations. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siwanyana. And to start, I would like to thank the briefers for their remarks. While the UK may differ with some of the comments made, we do welcome the co-hosts' apparent agreement that New York-based discussions should include focus on human rights and should include the participation of Human Rights Council bodies, including special procedures. As our hosts and other speakers have pointed out, humanitarian and development needs around the world are severe, and so the UK is proud of our role as a leading international aid donor. We will spend more than $14 billion in international aid this financial year, including on priorities such as sexual and reproductive health, girls' education, and poverty reduction. Regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, we have also committed nearly $1.8 billion to counter the pandemic's health, socio-economic, and humanitarian impacts, and have been at the forefront of multilateral efforts to promote equitable access to vaccines, treatments, and tests, including through the COVAX facility that a number of other speakers have referred to. Regarding autonomous sanctions or so-called unilateral coercive measures, we do disagree with many of the criticisms that have been put forward at today's meeting. For our part, we use autonomous sanctions as a targeted foreign policy tool to deter or constrain egregious behavior around the world. This may include breaches of international law, proliferation, human rights violations and abuses, or corruption. Some examples. One, the UK has employed autonomous sanctions against the military junta in Myanmar for their crimes against the Rohingya population and following their coup earlier this year. Two, we make no apology for maintaining sanctions on the Assad regime in Syria, which has been responsible for grievous breaches of international law, including the use of chemical weapons and the deliberate targeting of hospitals. If we want to see the undermining of national health systems, we really need look no further. The UK and our G7 partners stated last week that we will consider sanctions as part of our response to the unprecedented action by Belarus to force the landing of flight FR 4978 and arrest independent journalist Roman Prastayevich, an act that constituted a serious attack on civil aviation, as well as media freedom. Our sanctions are grounded in law, and are carefully targeted to avoid unintended humanitarian consequences. Humanitarian exemptions are in place. UK sanctions are also transparent. They're available on our gov.uk website and allow for due process protections and targeted individuals and entities to challenge the sanctions legally. This contrasts with some other states, including at least 2 of our co-hosts today, who have used their own autonomous sanctions measures instead as a political tool and as simple retaliation against critics of their human rights records, such as British and other European parliamentarians. I'll conclude by briefly returning to where I started, which is to again acknowledge the significant humanitarian and development needs around the world, particularly in the developing world. For our part, we do remain committed to action and international cooperation to address these challenges. But we believe the solution does not lie with undue focus on lawful, legitimate, and targeted sanctions. Rather, we believe the solutions should lie with determined action on international aid, like the UK's work that I highlighted earlier, addressing political actions that exacerbate these challenges, such as the intentional obstruction of humanitarian assistance, and governments around the world ceasing the egregious behaviour that weakens our international order and harms our ability to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the First Secretary of the UK Permanent Mission to the United Kingdom. We have taken note of the efforts of the UK government in addressing the plight of vulnerable people in various parts of the world and your contribution to the COVAX initiative. We have also taken note of your disagreement to some of the arguments that have been put across. You have in a very deliberate way, stated that your sanctions are often targeted and they are intended to undermine or to address some of the ills that affect human rights defenders and the population. Certainly, the debate should go on. We thank you for your contribution. We hope you can continue to have this discussion around this issue in the interest of what we call the common or the public good. Thank you, Your Excellency. I now would like to invite of the European delegation to the United Nations. Please make your remarks. Councillor, European Union Mission to the United Nations.
Thank you very much. I would like first to thank the organizer for this webinar, which deals with a very topical issue, and also to thank the panelists for their thought-provoking briefings. We are very grateful for the opportunity to discuss this issue and to bring some clarifications. I will start with a terminological clarification. EU sanctions are not coercive or punitive measures. They are measures targeted to those responsible for human rights abuses, for breaches of international law, flows of arms into war zones, and spoilers of peace processes. Unlike the sanctions recently imposed by some of the sponsors of this event against the EU sanctions are not retaliatory in nature. They support efforts to fight the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, repressive policy against the civilian population, terrorism, the proliferation of chemical weapons, or the threat of cyber attacks. As the concept note, but also some of the interveners and the briefer have touched upon the issue of the extraterritorial effect of sanctions, I would also like to bring some clarification in that regard. While the EU sanctions inherently have an effect in non-EU countries through pressure and on the targeted persons and entities, they apply only within the EU jurisdiction. The obligations they impose are binding only on EU nationals or person located in the EU or doing business in the EU. Therefore, EU sanctions have no extraterritorial application. We fully agree that sanctions must respect the UN Charter and the principles of international law. Yet, international law is no hindrance to the effective use of sanctions as a tool to maintain and restore international peace and security and to protect human rights. EU sanctions are not meant to stand in the way nor to impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance, including the fight against COVID-19 pandemic. The EU includes humanitarian exceptions in its sanction regimes and has an effective framework in place to use for the use of such exemptions by humanitarian organizations. All these elements intend to reduce as much as possible any adverse humanitarian effects or unintended consequences for the persons who are not targeted. Finally, we challenge the assumptions that sanctions are responsible for failure of the national health system or for affecting the well-being of women, children, persons with disabilities, or other people in vulnerable situations. Facts should prevail. It is actually the use of chemical weapons against its own population, measures taken to undermine democracy and the rule of law, brutal actions by military juntas and other gross violation of human rights that make women and children vulnerable or render people disabled. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Councillor Simon Papan of the European delegation to the United Nations. Like the UK, a representative, you have argued that your sanctions are targeted. They are intended to ensure that the civilian population do not suffer harm. They are intended to uphold the international principles. They are not inconsistent with the UN Charter, and certainly we welcome further debate in that direction. Thank you so much for your remarks. We appreciate them. Now, I have received a request from the Russian permanent representative to the UN who would like to make a brief comment as a follow-up. May I now invite Your Excellency, Dmitry Shumakov, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia to the United Nations, to make a follow-up comment as requested. Please strictly 1 minute because we have run short of time.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I couldn't abstain from comments that I want to first thank my colleagues from EU and UK that they didn't dodge, but they were part of our discussions. I think this is important. Second, yes, our positions are way far from each other. We absolutely disagree with a lot of estimates, with a lot of justifications. And we will continue this discussion and be continuing engaged in this discussion. And of course, if you look, for example, at the situation of vulnerable groups of population in the targeted countries, they were not that vulnerable before the unilateral sanctions. I think this just gives a very simple answer. But I wanted to also comment about the UK bringing in our discussion the case with the flight in Minsk and Protasevich arrest. I'm not sure this is relevant for today's discussion, first. And second, I wanted to know to my distinguished colleague from UK that should he see what's on the web right now and the evidence that Mr. Protasevich is giving, I think he would have abstained from commenting this because I think there would be much less appetite to from our colleagues to use this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia to the United Nations, for your follow-up comment. I guess the discussions will continue. Before I invite the panelists to make their closing remarks, I have a request from Syria who would like to also make a follow-up comment. Could you, the permanent representative of Syria to the United Nations, can you kindly restrict your comment to just 1 minute?
Sure, thank you very much, Your Excellency. I actually
representative of Syria to the United Nations.
Thank you very much. Actually, my name is Wael, First Secretary at the Permanent Mission of the Syrian Arab Republic. I didn't want this important session to turn into a confrontation. Yes, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Hello? Yeah. Actually, thank you very much.
Yes,
my name is Wael from the First Secretary at the Permanent Mission of the Syrian Arab Republic. I didn't want this important session to turn into confrontation with other participants. The facts are clear, and I would only tell our colleague from UK that his government was and still involved in supporting terrorism and destruction in Syria. So they lost any legal and moral qualification to speak or evaluate the situation in Syria, or desperately try to find baseless legal framework for them and for the EU sanctions on the Syrian people. I thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thank you so much, the Secretary of the Syrian Mission to the United Nations, for your follow-up comment. I now would like to invite the panelists to make their closing remarks, and please restrict them to 1 or 2 minutes if you can. I now would like to invite Dr. Elena Dohan. Dr. Elena Dohan, the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact on unilateral coercive measures. Kindly make your closing remarks, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank everyone who was presenting today, sharing their view on the situation. That's a good ground and the good floor for the discussion of situation. I'm very much welcoming the factual-based approach and evidence-based approach in this sphere, and I hope that that's a starting point for us to discuss the evidences and facts indeed. In the very facts which I have collected and which have been reported by states and humanitarian organizations, as well as people in the health sector as well, show that quite often unilateral sanctions affect the whole population, and the health system is the first one to be affected. And I need to mention on that regard that unfortunately, the fact that unilateral sanctions are affecting the health system is not an abstract notion. We're not talking about the some sort of academic or philosophical discussion. We speak about real people whose human rights are affected and whose lives are endangered a lot. And that's why I would like to use the chance to invite everyone to establish a sort of the database which will provide for statistics and the factual background so that it could be discussed. And it has already been done, at least partially, by a number of non-governmental organizations as concerned the humanitarian impact of counterterrorism sanctions and counterterrorism measures. So the work is already started. The second point is the point of legality, which has been raised here. And that's an important part for academics to come together. And I'm repeating my invitation for academics from all around the world to start thinking about the legality aspects. My experience of organizing expert meeting in April in Geneva was really wonderful on that regard. And the very last point, which I believe is very important, again, we're speaking about the facts, and I'm reaffirming my availability and my readiness to be involved with individual cases to show up how the lives of real people is being affected on that regard. And again, I would like to thank co-host of the event for the possibility to discuss this really important, vital issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elena Dohan, the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, for your closing remarks. I now would like to invite Ambassador Zami Akram, the Chair Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council Working Group on the Right to Development, to make your closing remarks, strictly 2 minutes. Ambassador Zami Akram, closing remarks. Ambassador Zami Akram, closing remarks. Okay, I'm not getting a response from Ambassador Zami Akram. Can I then invite Dr. Janet Blake? Dr. Janet Blake, for your closing remarks. Are you there?
I am here, yes. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I would just like, I didn't go into the question of legality when I spoke, but I would just like to remind ourselves that not only did the Human Rights Council itself state in 2014 that unilateral coercive measures and legislation are contrary to international law, but we also have numerous reports from human rights treaty bodies such as the CESCR and others that have made it clear that there are serious limitations on when and how such measures should be used, particularly when they harm rights essential for human dignity and survival, especially women and children. Now, my experience of living in Iran for the past 20 years under sanctions of various kinds, I can testify from that to the reality that whatever the justification may be given for imposing them, they inevitably violate the human rights of civilian populations and, of course, particularly those of vulnerable members of those populations. This is inescapable. I would like to share very quickly with you an anecdote from a Syrian colleague of mine who had a friend who was a teacher who, when she went to school, she saw that one of her pupils was laying her head on the desk and asked her if she hadn't slept properly the night before and was ready to punish her. And the child's answer was, "Oh, no, today is the day that my brother gets to eat." I think that starkly illustrates how these sanction regimes are violating rights in a very extreme fashion, which brings us to the idea that violations of human rights that are egregious and that are part of some kind of program become at some point violations of jus cogens norms of human rights. But I would like to finish in a slightly more positive note and come back to the important idea that this is ultimately a question of global and common concern. We all live in this planet together, and our actions today impact on everyone. We can't escape that, which is why such discussions as the important meeting today are very necessary and urgent. And really, we should seek to find better, more equitable, and frankly, more effective ways of responding to international problems and disputes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janet Blake, for your closing remarks. I think you have introduced that very interesting phenomena of jus cogens and how this actually amounts to a breach of the jus cogens. I now would like to try again, Ambassador Zami Akram. Are you still there? Ambassador Akram, for your closing remarks. Looks like Ambassador Zami Akram is nowhere to be seen or heard. I would now like to make the closing remark to the end of our webinar. First, I want to thank most sincerely the co-hosts of this webinar, of Belarus, Bolivia, China, Cuba, Iran, Nicaragua, Russia, Syria, Venezuela, and to the United Nations for this initiative. I think we have learned a lot, and I think what remains for us is to follow up with very concrete actions. I would like also to distinguished panelists. Thank you so much for your excellent inputs, your views, your concerns, proposals. I would like to thank very heartedly the convenes, particularly the permanent delegation of Iran for this initiative. Now, when the world is badly in need of multilateral solutions for resolving global problems caused by COVID-19 pandemic, the increasing application and promulgation of measures, in our considered opinion, is a serious threat to the world's stability. Application of national laws with the extraterritorial effects against principles of international particular is unlawful and contravenes equal sovereignty of UN member states. No one then is immune of the impact of sinful behavior. Unilateral coercive measures essentially collective indiscriminate punishment of civilians, abuse national might to score political gains through harming civilians definitely is inexcusable. Any measure that says of a whole population to medicine and medical equipment that has practical negative livelihood of ordinary people would not only be totally unacceptable, but would not be consistent with the UN principles and values. It could be a war with the other name. The main difference, therefore, is that unlike conventional wars against children, women, patients, the elderly, poor, and other vulnerable populations, justify taking civilians hostage, notably children, women, the elderly, the poor, patients, for any political rivalries. The main message, I think, arising out of this webinar was an emphasis on the need for taking action and transferring the words to the deeds by the international community against application and promulgation of unilateral coercive measures. I did, however, to take note that where there are actions that actually are intended to correct actions, situations that lead to abuse of fundamental rights or cause unnecessary harm, definitely should be put in context. With that, I now wish to thank you all, as well as all other stakeholders, for this very wonderful exchange that we have had. I am aware that this is a follow-up webinar that was held, and I think it's important that we translate our discussions into concrete action. With that, I would like to bring to the end this webinar and look forward to further collaboration and cooperation among the different UN member states in the interest of upholding the UN Charter, its values and principles for the common good. I thank you. Have a good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are.